You're not supposed to be here." The words cracked across the marble lobby with the force of a slammed door, silencing the quiet murmur of travelers checking in beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. Every head turned toward the entrance. A black woman in a neatly pressed navy coat stood just inside the revolving doors, one hand resting lightly on the handle of a worn leather suitcase. Naomi Brooks neither stepped backward nor hurried to explain herself. She simply met the accusation with calm eyes that revealed nothing. The scent of polished cedar drifted through the grand lobby as morning sunlight poured through the towering glass facade, casting long ribbons of gold across the white marble floor. Bellmen paused beside brass luggage carts. A family waiting to check out lowered their voices. Somewhere near the cafe, porcelain cups clicked softly against saucers before even those ordinary sounds dissolved into an uneasy silence. Richard Collins, the hotel's general manager, strode toward the woman with sharp, impatient steps. His tailored charcoal suit looked immaculate, every crease perfectly pressed, every movement carrying the confidence of a man convinced he controlled everything beneath the hotel's roof. He glanced briefly at Naomi's modest clothes, the inexpensive suitcase, and the absence of any luxury shopping bags or chauffeur waiting outside. In his mind, the conclusion formed before a single question was asked. "This area is reserved for registered guests," he said loudly enough for half the lobby to hear. "You'll need to leave immediately." Naomi's expression remained composed. "Good morning," she answered politely. "I'd like to look around before speaking with someone from management." Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. "Management is speaking to you." Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. One elderly couple stopped beside the fountain, pretending to admire the flowers while quietly listening. Two receptionists froze behind the front desk, their fingers hovering above computer keyboards. Naomi looked slowly across the magnificent lobby. Fresh orchids decorated polished tables. A pianist in the corner had stopped playing mid-melody, his hands suspended above the ivory keys. Every detail seemed carefully maintained, every surface reflecting excellence. Yet beneath the elegant surroundings, something colder lingered in the air, something measured not by architecture, but by judgment. "I'm not causing any trouble," Naomi said gently. "I only wish to walk through the property." Richard folded his arms. "People don't simply wander into private hotels." His voice hardened, especially through the executive entrance. Naomi briefly glanced toward the revolving doors behind her. The front entrance was blocked for maintenance. Convenient excuse. Richard took another step closer. "Security cameras recorded you entering without authorization. I won't allow trespassers to roam this building." The word hung in the air like smoke. "Trespasser." A young concierge shifted uneasily, but said nothing. A housekeeper pushing a linen cart lowered her eyes. No one interrupted. No one challenged the manager's certainty. Naomi drew a slow breath. "Would you consider verifying who I am before making assumptions?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I've seen enough." Pulling a radio from his belt, he spoke without looking away from her. "Security to the main lobby." Immediately, the response crackled almost instantly. Within moments, two uniformed security officers appeared from opposite corridors, slowing as they noticed the quietly standing woman before looking toward Richard for instructions. Naomi neither protested nor attempted to leave. She simply rested both hands on the handle of her suitcase and waited. The silence growing around her somehow felt heavier than shouting. Richard pulled out his phone, his face set with absolute certainty. Without hesitation, he dialed emergency services. "Yes," he said firmly as countless eyes watched the scene unfold. "I'd like to report a trespasser refusing to leave private property. Please send officers immediately." Across the lobby, several guests instinctively lifted their phones, recording the confrontation. Naomi noticed the glowing screens, but showed no anger. Instead, she slowly raised her eyes toward the enormous bronze plaque mounted above the reception desk. Its engraved words caught the morning light. "Hospitality begins with respect." For the first time since entering the building, the faintest hint of sadness crossed her face. Then it disappeared as quietly as it had come. The flashing blue lights arrived faster than anyone expected. Their reflections swept across the towering glass entrance, dancing over polished marble and chrome like cold waves washing through a place that had built its reputation on warmth. Naomi Brooks watched the patrol car roll to a stop without the slightest change in her expression. She had seen power before. Real power rarely needed to raise its voice. Around her, whispers multiplied. Guests leaned toward one another, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. Someone quietly muttered that the woman should have left when she had the chance. Another guest insisted Richard Collins was simply protecting the property. A young mother gently pulled her son closer, not because Naomi looked dangerous, but because everyone else had already decided she was. The judgment spread faster than facts ever could. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly to the leather suitcase beside her. The corners had been worn smooth by years of airports, train stations, business conferences, and quiet journeys no newspaper had ever covered. 3 days earlier, she had landed in New York after nearly 8 years living in Singapore, where she had built hotels people praised for making every stranger feel welcome. None of those achievements mattered here. This morning, she was simply another black woman standing alone in an expensive lobby while strangers decided where she belonged. The heavy burden of returning home rested deeper than the suitcase she carried. Only 2 weeks had passed since her father's funeral. Charles Brooks had spent 40 years transforming a single neighborhood hotel into one of the country's most respected luxury hospitality groups. While magazines celebrated his business success, very few people knew his greatest pride had never been profits. It had been the promise he repeated throughout Naomi's childhood. "A hotel isn't a building," he would always tell her. "It's how people feel 5 seconds after they walk through the door." Those words echoed quietly inside her mind as she looked around the magnificent lobby, now filled with suspicion instead of welcome. After his passing, the entire Brooks Hospitality Group had transferred into Naomi's name. Lawyers had insisted on formal introductions, executive meetings, carefully planned announcements, and media interviews. She refused every one of them. Before anyone learned who she was, she wanted to discover what kind of company she had inherited. She wanted the truth, not polished presentations prepared for a new owner. So she booked no limousine. She dismissed security. She wore simple clothes. She carried her own luggage. She even instructed the board to tell no one she was coming. If the culture was healthy, it would reveal itself naturally. If it wasn't, she intended to see that too. Richard Collins had unknowingly become the first chapter of that answer. One of the younger receptionists, Emily Parker, watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. She had joined the hotel only 6 months earlier and remembered hearing whispers about the mysterious heir who had never attended corporate events. Nobody knew what the new owner looked like. Some believed it would be an older businessman. Others assumed a wealthy investor from overseas. None imagined she could be the quiet black woman now standing beside security without raising her voice. Emily glanced nervously toward Richard. More than once she had seen him judge guests before greeting them. Employees rarely questioned him. They simply learned which people received smiles and which received suspicion. Outside, one of the officers stepped from the patrol car and adjusted his duty belt before walking toward the entrance. Inside, Naomi gently brushed an invisible speck of dust from the handle of her father's old suitcase. The leather was cracked with age, but she had never replaced it. Her father used to joke that good luggage should tell stories before its owner ever spoke. Standing beneath the enormous crystal chandelier, surrounded by strangers who saw only her skin and her modest appearance, Naomi silently wondered what story this hotel believed it was telling today. Officer Daniel Harper stepped through the revolving doors first, his polished boots clicking softly across the marble floor as Officer Melissa Grant followed close behind. Neither officer appeared rushed. Years of responding to public disputes had taught them that the loudest voice in a room rarely told the whole story. Richard Collins approached before either officer could speak. "Officers, thank you for coming." This woman entered through a restricted entrance, ignored repeated requests to leave, and is trespassing on private property. His words came quickly, confidently, as though the outcome had already been decided. Daniel nodded politely, but turned his attention to Naomi Brooks. She stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, both hands resting lightly on the handle of her worn leather suitcase. No anger, no panic, no attempt to leave, only remarkable composure. "Ma'am," Melissa asked, "may I have your name?" "Naomi Brooks," she replied evenly. Daniel gave a small nod. "And are you refusing to leave the property today?" Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. I'm willing to cooperate with any lawful request, officer. I only hoped someone here would ask who I was before deciding why I came. Her answer lingered over the lobby, drawing uneasy glances from several guests. Richard folded his arms tighter. She's avoiding the question. Daniel calmly shook his head. Actually, she answered it. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Employees instinctively looked toward Richard before reacting, a habit that had become second nature over the years. During his 12 years as general manager, Richard had earned a reputation for discipline, spotless inspections, and impressive financial results. Corporate executives praised him for protecting the hotel's image. Yet another culture had quietly taken root beneath those achievements. Bellmen learned which guests deserved immediate smiles. Receptionists noticed designer luggage before offering upgrades. Delivery drivers waited outside, while wealthy travelers were welcomed without delay. Appearance often came before dignity, even if no policy ever said so aloud. Emily Parker knew that pattern better than most. Only a month earlier, she had watched an elderly black veteran in faded clothes wait nearly 20 minutes while a businessman who arrived later was checked in first. When she questioned it afterward, Richard had dismissed the decision as simply reading the room. Emily never forgot the look on the veteran's face as he quietly thanked the staff anyway. Looking at Naomi now, the same uneasy feeling returned. Across the lobby, one of the security guards leaned toward his partner and whispered, "Maybe she'll apologize and this will be over." Naomi heard him but showed no reaction. She had no intention of defending herself with wealth or titles. She wanted to discover whether kindness still existed inside the company her father had spent 40 years building. Daniel slowly surveyed the elegant lobby. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Fresh lilies scented the air. The pianist had resumed playing, but every note sounded restrained, as though even the music sensed the tension. The building looked flawless. The people did not. Some guests watched with curiosity. Others quietly recorded the scene on their phones. Nearly every employee seemed more concerned with Richard's expression than with the woman standing alone beside the old suitcase. Daniel had seen enough workplaces to recognize that kind of silence. It was the silence people learned when disagreeing with the wrong person carried consequences. Standing beneath the bronze plaque engraved with the words "Hospitality begins with respect," Naomi quietly wondered how many ordinary people had walked through those same doors believing the promise applied to everyone, only to discover it depended on who they appeared to be. Officer Daniel Harper slipped a small notepad from his jacket but never opened it. Instead, he studied the three people standing before him. Richard Collins carried himself with the confidence of a manager convinced he was protecting his hotel. Naomi Brooks remained beside her old leather suitcase, calm enough to make the growing tension feel strangely one-sided. Daniel had responded to countless trespassing calls, yet this one refused to follow a familiar pattern. "Ms. Brooks," he asked, "do you have identification with you?" "Yes," Naomi answered without hesitation. Before Daniel could continue, Richard stepped in. "That won't change the fact that she isn't authorized to be here." Daniel raised a hand, stopping him. "I'll decide what changes the facts, Mr. Collins." Richard fell silent, though the frustration on his face became impossible to hide. Naomi slowly reached into her coat pocket and rested her fingers on a simple leather card holder. For a brief moment, she looked toward the executive offices above the lobby. Then, without removing anything, she quietly slipped the holder back into her pocket. Melissa noticed the movement. "Did you change your mind?" she asked. Naomi nodded faintly. "Yes." Richard frowned. "Why?" Naomi looked directly at him. "Because this stopped being about proving who I am several minutes ago." Confused whispers spread through the lobby. "Then what's it about?" Richard demanded. Naomi slowly turned her eyes across the room. She saw Emily standing rigid behind the front desk, the elderly housekeeper frozen beside her linen cart, the concierge pretending to organize room keys, and the bellman avoiding eye contact. "It's about discovering how this hotel treats someone it believes has no importance." Her words were quiet, yet they seemed to fill the entire lobby. Daniel remained silent, letting them settle. Melissa stepped toward Richard once more. "Has she threatened anyone?" "No." "Damaged property?" "No." "Refused any lawful instruction from police?" Richard hesitated before answering. "Not yet." The officers exchanged a brief glance. The facts sounded very different from the urgency of the emergency call they had received. Richard sensed the conversation slipping beyond his control. "This is private property," he insisted. "As general manager, I have every right to ask someone who doesn't belong here to leave." Daniel nodded slightly. "You do have that authority, but authority doesn't prevent us from asking questions first." The answer left Richard visibly irritated. Around them, guests continued watching in complete silence. Several employees looked relieved that someone had finally interrupted the manager instead of immediately agreeing with him. Naomi noticed their reactions more than Richard's words. She remembered something her father often told new managers. The fastest way to understand a hotel's culture is not by watching the guests. It's by watching the employees when they think no one important is looking. Standing in the center of the lobby, she realized she was seeing exactly what she had come to find. Fear had become routine. Kindness had become selective. Respect depended too often on appearance. She could end the confrontation in seconds by revealing the identification still resting inside her pocket. Instead, she left it there. If respect only arrived after people discovered her title, then the lesson she had traveled across the world to learn would already be lost. Richard Collins could feel control slipping away, and for a man who had spent 12 years running the Grand Brooks Hotel, uncertainty was something he refused to tolerate. Guests had stopped pretending not to watch. More phones were quietly raised. The whispers that had filled the lobby only minutes earlier faded into tense silence as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Straightening his jacket, Richard took one deliberate step toward the officers. "I'm formally requesting that she be removed from this property," he said firmly. "If necessary, arrest her for criminal trespassing." The words echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Emily Parker felt her stomach tighten. She looked toward Naomi, expecting fear, anger, or at least frustration. Instead, Naomi remained composed, her hands still resting lightly on the handle of the worn leather suitcase. Daniel Harper exchanged a brief glance with Melissa Grant. Neither officer had seen Naomi threaten anyone, damage property, or resist instructions. The situation no longer matched the urgency of the dispatch call. "Ms. Brooks," Daniel said calmly, "if management insists that you leave, I'm asking one final time. Will you step outside while we sort this out?" Naomi slowly looked around the lobby. Employees lowered their eyes. Guests waited for confrontation. She could end everything by revealing a single document. Yet instead she asked quietly, "Officer, may I ask you one question?" Daniel nodded. "Go ahead. If someone decides another person doesn't belong before learning a single thing about them, does asking that person to leave solve the problem, or simply hide it?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Before he could speak, Richard interrupted sharply. "This isn't a philosophy lesson. Remove her." Even Melissa frowned at the impatience in his voice. Richard turned toward the security officers. "Escort her outside now." The two guards hesitated. They respected the general manager, but neither wanted to place hands on a woman who had remained calm and cooperative from the moment they arrived. After several uncomfortable seconds, one guard stepped forward. "Ma'am, please come with us." Naomi gave him a gentle smile. "I know you're only doing your job. I won't make this harder for you." Her kindness made the silence in the lobby even heavier. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Naomi reached for the handle of her father's old suitcase and slowly turned toward the entrance. After only a few steps, she stopped before a framed black and white photograph hanging beside the grand staircase. It showed Charles Brooks standing shoulder to shoulder with housekeepers, cooks, engineers, bellmen, and receptionists on the hotel's opening day. No executives stood in front. No VIP guests occupied the center. Every employee smiled as though they belonged equally. Naomi remembered taking that photograph as a teenager while her father insisted everyone move closer together. "People will forget who owned the hotel," he had whispered afterward. "But they'll never forget how they were treated inside it." The memory lasted only a heartbeat before Richard's remaining patience disappeared. "Officer," he barked, pointing toward Naomi. "If she refuses to leave another second longer, put her in handcuffs. I'm pressing charges." A wave of disbelief swept through the lobby. Several guests lowered their phones, suddenly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Even the pianist stopped playing. Naomi quietly closed her eyes, tightened her grip on the old leather suitcase, and at that exact moment, the soft chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the silent hotel. The soft chime echoed through the silent lobby. Every head turned toward the private executive elevator beside the grand staircase as its polished brass doors slid open. 3 people stepped out with hurried, purposeful strides. At the front was William Foster, chairman of the board of Brooks Hospitality Group. Beside him walked Chief Legal Officer Helen Mercer, followed by the company's longtime attorney, Samuel Reed, carrying a slim leather portfolio. Richard Collins felt an immediate wave of relief. Surely corporate leadership had arrived to support his decision. Straightening his tie, he stepped forward with renewed confidence. "Mr. Foster, I'm glad you're here," he said. "We've had an unfortunate security situation involving a trespasser." William barely acknowledged him. His attention had already shifted beyond Richard to the woman standing quietly beside the worn leather suitcase. For a brief moment, concern crossed his face before giving way to unmistakable relief. He walked directly toward Naomi without slowing. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "We've been trying to reach you for over an hour." The words seemed to pull every sound out of the room. Naomi offered a small smile. "Good morning, William." Without hesitation, William extended both hands respectfully toward her. "Welcome home." Helen Mercer lowered her head politely. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks." Samuel Reed opened the leather portfolio. "The board is assembled and waiting whenever you're ready." Richard stared in disbelief. His eyes moved from William to Naomi, then to the old suitcase beside her feet. Everything he believed about the last 30 minutes collapsed at once. "Ms. Brooks?" he whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. Only then did William notice the police officers, the security guards, and the dozens of silent guests surrounding them. His expression changed immediately. "What happened here?" he asked, looking directly at Richard. The general manager opened his mouth, but no explanation came. Emily Parker felt her knees weaken behind the reception desk. Every rumor about the mysterious heir who had inherited Brooks' hospitality after Charles Brooks' passing suddenly became real. Officer Daniel Harper quietly lowered his notepad. At last, Naomi's calmness made perfect sense. She had never tried to win the argument because she wasn't there to prove who she was. She was there to discover who everyone else would choose to be. Naomi glanced once toward the bronze plaque above the reception desk. Asterisk hospitality begins with respect asterisk, before looking back at William. "Before we begin today's meeting," she said softly, "I think everyone here deserves to understand why I came without announcing myself." William slowly followed her gaze across the lobby. Frightened employees, uncomfortable guests, 2 security guards who had hesitated to follow an order. Finally, his eyes settled on Richard Collins. The man who had seemed completely in control only moments earlier now stood frozen beneath the very words his hotel claimed to represent. For the first time in 12 years, Richard no longer looked like the general manager of the Grand Brooks Hotel. He looked like a man about to confront the cost of every assumption he had made. No one spoke. The silence hanging over the lobby felt heavier than the accusation that had brought the police there only minutes earlier. Naomi Brooks rested one hand on the worn leather suitcase before turning toward William Foster. "I asked the board not to announce my arrival," she said calmly. "I wanted to experience this hotel the way any ordinary guest would. No security, no introductions, no special treatment, just the truth." William nodded quietly. "That was your father's way." A faint smile crossed Naomi's face. He always believed the real culture of a hotel appeared only when no one thought the owner was watching. Her words settled over the room. Richard Collins lowered his head as every decision he had made replayed in painful detail. He had never welcomed her, never asked her name, never wondered why she had come. He had looked at her skin, her modest clothes, and her old suitcase, then decided she didn't belong. Naomi looked directly at him. "Richard, today wasn't the first time this happened inside this hotel." He slowly raised his eyes. It was simply the first time it happened to someone who could reveal it. Emily Parker felt tears gather in her eyes. She remembered the elderly black veteran who had been ignored, the delivery drivers left waiting outside in bad weather, and the quiet apologies employees whispered after Richard walked away. None of them had changed anything because no one with authority had seen them. Naomi turned toward the staff gathered near the reception desk. "My father spent 40 years teaching that hospitality begins with respect, not appearance, wealth, or status." Somewhere along the way, those words became part of the decor instead of part of the culture. Several employees lowered their eyes. Even the security officers looked uncomfortable. Daniel Harper glanced toward the bronze plaque above the reception desk and silently wondered how many people had walked beneath those words without ever feeling welcomed. Richard finally found his voice. "Ms. Brooks, I am deeply sorry." His words trembled with genuine shame. "There isn't a single excuse for what I did today." Naomi studied him for a long moment before answering. "No," she said softly. "There isn't." The honesty in her reply hurt more than anger would have. She took one slow step closer. "The question now isn't whether you regret today." She paused, allowing the silence to settle once more. "It's whether you're willing to become the kind of leader who would never allow this to happen to anyone again." Richard felt every eye in the lobby resting on him. For the first time in his career, he understood that protecting a hotel's reputation had never begun with protecting its image. It had always begun with protecting the dignity of the people who walked through its doors. Richard Collins stood motionless, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. The confidence that had defined him for 12 years had vanished, replaced by the quiet weight of undeniable truth. Around him, employees waited in complete silence. Some expected Naomi to dismiss him immediately. Others believed the board would make that decision for her. William Foster remained where he was, saying nothing. He understood this moment belonged to Naomi alone. Instead of walking toward the executive elevator, she took a slow step toward Richard. "How many people work in this hotel?" she asked. The unexpected question caught him off guard. 243, he answered quietly. Naomi nodded. "Then 243 families depend on the culture inside this building." She looked around the lobby before continuing. "My father used to say that guests may remember the marble floors for a day, but they'll remember how they were treated for years." Her eyes settled on Emily Parker. "Emily, how long have you worked here?" 6 months, ma'am." "Have you always felt comfortable speaking up when something seemed wrong?" Emily hesitated, glancing briefly at Richard before answering honestly. "No, ma'am." The single word echoed through the silent lobby. Naomi turned toward the elderly housekeeper standing beside her linen cart. "And you?" The woman lowered her eyes. "Most of us learned it was safer to stay quiet." Several employees quietly nodded in agreement. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Hearing the truth from the people he had led for years hurt more than any public embarrassment. Naomi faced him once again. "Replacing one manager might satisfy today's anger," she said calmly. "But it won't change tomorrow's culture." Richard slowly lifted his head. "Then let me start changing it." His voice trembled openly. "I judged you before I knew you. I confused appearance with character, confidence with leadership, and authority with respect. I can't undo what happened today, but if you allow me the chance, I'll spend every day proving I've learned from it." Naomi studied him for several long seconds before speaking. "Beginning today, you will step away from your management position." Richard nodded immediately. "You'll spend the next several months working beside every department in this hotel: housekeeping, reception, maintenance, food service, and guest relations. You'll learn from the people whose work you've too often overlooked. When they're ready to trust you again, only then will we discuss your future." "I understand," Richard replied quietly. Naomi turned toward the employees gathered throughout the lobby. "From this day forward, respect will never depend on a guest's appearance, wealth, race, or position. Every employee will have the freedom to speak when something is wrong, and every manager will be judged not only by results, but by the dignity they show others." A quiet wave of emotion spread across the room. Emily smiled through her tears. The housekeeper straightened her shoulders. Even the 2 security guards seemed to breathe more easily. For the first time that morning, the words engraved above the reception desk no longer felt like decoration. They sounded like a promise the Grand Brooks Hotel was finally ready to keep. 6 months later, the Grand Brooks Hotel looked much the same from the outside. Morning sunlight still poured through the towering glass facade. Crystal chandeliers still reflected across polished marble floors, and fresh white lilies still welcomed guests into the elegant lobby. Yet everyone who worked there understood that the greatest changes could not be seen in photographs. They could only be felt in the way people were greeted from the moment they stepped through the doors. Naomi Brooks had spent the past 6 months quietly rebuilding the culture her father had devoted his life to creating. Company policies were rewritten, but more importantly, daily habits began to change. Promotions were no longer based only on financial performance. Managers were also evaluated on empathy, fairness, and the respect they showed guests and employees alike. Every department leader spent regular shifts working alongside housekeeping, reception, maintenance, restaurant staff, and bell services, learning that leadership began with understanding work they had once only supervised. Richard Collins kept the promise he had made in the lobby that morning. He stepped away from management without complaint and spent months rotating through every department of the hotel. He carried luggage beside the bell staff, cleaned guest rooms with housekeeping, served breakfast during busy weekends, answered phones at reception, and worked late evenings with the maintenance team. He apologized where apologies were owed and never asked anyone to forgive him before they were ready. Some employees welcomed his efforts quickly. Others remained cautious. Richard accepted both reactions. He had finally learned that trust could never be demanded. It had to be earned through consistent actions, one ordinary day at a time. Emily Parker, once afraid to question unfair decisions, now helped lead guest experience training for new employees. During every orientation, she pointed to the bronze plaque above the reception desk and reminded each new hire that the words "hospitality begins with respect" were not a slogan for visitors. They were a promise every employee carried into work each day. On a quiet autumn morning, the revolving doors turned slowly as an elderly black woman entered carrying 2 worn shopping bags and an old leather suitcase. Her coat showed years of use, and she paused uncertainly just inside the lobby, looking around as if she wasn't sure she belonged there. A few guests glanced in her direction before returning to their conversations. Richard noticed her immediately. Without hesitation, he walked over with a warm smile and opened the door wider behind her. "Good morning," he said kindly. "Welcome to the Grand Brooks Hotel. How may I help you today?" Relief spread across the woman's face. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," she replied softly. "She has a job interview here, and I arrived a little early." Richard smiled. "Then you've come to exactly the right place." He carried her old leather suitcase himself, guided her to a comfortable chair beside the fireplace, and returned a few moments later with a cup of hot tea. He never asked whether she had a reservation. He never questioned whether she belonged. He simply welcomed her the way every guest deserved to be welcomed. From the second-floor balcony, Naomi Brooks watched quietly beside William Foster. Neither of them spoke. Richard laughed gently with the elderly woman as she thanked him for his kindness, completely unaware that anyone was observing him. Naomi's eyes rested for a moment on the old leather suitcase beside the woman's chair. It reminded her of the suitcase that had once belonged to her father and of the lesson he had carried with him to every hotel he ever owned. A faint smile crossed her face. She no longer needed reports, inspections, or board meetings to know whether the culture of the Grand Brooks Hotel had truly changed. She could see it in one simple act of welcome offered freely to a stranger who appeared to have nothing to offer in return. Satisfied, Naomi quietly turned and walked down the corridor as the sounds of conversation, rolling suitcases, gentle piano music, and genuine hospitality blended into the quiet legacy her father had always hoped would outlive them both.